Today I'm speaking to Dan Archer. He's a domiciliary care home provider. This is in-home care for people between the ages of 18 up until their latter years.
My name is Dan Archer. I'm the founder and chief executive of a business called Visiting Angels. We're a domiciliary care provider. We founded the business because we believed carers needed to be treated better in work, and so we founded the business as a carer-centric organisation. We've tried to make caregivers the most important people in our organisation, and that's better pay and proper contracts, and also ensuring the working environment is one that it's an easier one for a carer to do. So that's what we're trying to do.
So what sort of age group would your carers be dealing with from to?
We deal with anybody who's over 18, so adults, although the majority of the clients that we're supporting are people who are towards the end of their life, so people in their elder years. So probably 75 to 80 would be the main age group.
And so you've found some data which is quite incredible. And you drew this data down over a 2-year period, which actually shows that there's about 500,000 carers, well 65% are paid below the minimum wage. So can you explain why that might be happening?
Yeah, so we found that the data comes from a website, Fairer Carer Pay, and what the website does is it asks carers to talk about their pay, how much they get paid, and also whether they get paid for their drive time in between visits. So basically the transitions that the carer would do from one call into the next. And what the data shows is that once the unpaid driving that a carer does is taken into account, 65% of them are paid below the legal minimum wage. That all employers know that they have to meet the minimum wage legislation. They have to pay their carers at least the minimum wage.
Yeah.
And the challenge with the employer's national insurance contribution increase is that it's made a lot of those care providers who were already quite tight on cash even tighter on cash. And so the practice has actually got worse since April when that change happened. So between April and today, the number is now 71% of carers who are paid illegally, and also the amount that they're short paid, the distance, if you will, below minimum wage has increased now. It's gone from £1.91 below minimum wage to £2.51 below minimum wage. So more carers are being paid even worse since April.
What would be like a typical day for a carer? How many visits would they be making? How many of those journeys would they be making?
Yeah, and I think that the nature of home care, domiciliary care, is that the caregiver is always going to be driving from somewhere to somewhere. Right? They don't work in an institution, as many do in residential care. They drive to work and they will work in a care home and stay there all day. The nature of what we do as a home care provider is that a carer will go from home to their first client, and then another client, and another client, and another client. Now, if the sort of work that provider, the agency that employs them, is doing is commissioned by the local authority, those visits tend to be shorter visits. Might be a 15-minute, 20-minute, or half an hour visit that is being done by the carer in that situation. Now, if your working day is split into instances of care in 15-minute blocks, in order to do a 6-hour paid working day, you might be doing 24 separate visits. So it's not uncommon for a carer to maybe do 20 to 30 visits per day in that situation. Now, if there's only 5 minutes driving in between each visit, inevitably that then can lead to, for 6 hours of paid work, potentially 2 hours of unpaid work in that day.
So has the government actually offered anything, any kind of way of dealing with this? Has Labour made any kind of gestures as towards dealing with this pay gap?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think no matter which flavour of government we're talking about, the scale of this problem is a problem that they're struggling to deal with. We're talking about, on the current data, 578,000 workers who are potentially paid illegally. That's the majority of the workforce, in actual fact. So I've written to politicians, I've met politicians, I've written to politicians, we've talked an awful lot about the scale of this problem. The latest news is that during the Labour conference, Wes Streeting announced an amount of £500 million was going to be invested by 2028 in order to fix carer pay. The problem with £500 million by 2028 is, on the data that we have from Fairer Carer Pay, the cost of moving carers from where they are currently to the legal minimum is £2.2 billion today. So that £500 million by 2028 is too little too late.
What would a carer do in that 15 minutes? I'm just curious, what the sort of What would be their typical thing? And if they're dealing with sort of an elderly person
Yeah.
who's quite fragile, what can they achieve in 15 minutes?
In short visits, it's very, very difficult for the carer to actually achieve anything, really. I mean, the focus becomes very much on task, on time and task. You know, medication reminders, feeding, helping people out of bed, helping people to dress. And it becomes very functional because in 15 minutes it can't be anything other than functional. So, you know, with our organisation we do a minimum 1 hour visit because we believe it's really important that people are able to move at the pace they want to move at, not at the pace that's prescribed by somebody that's paying for the care separately. The problem, I think, the real problem for carers in that situation is they never really get enough time to adequately care. And they also don't get time to see the closure on the instance of care that they're involved in. So they don't get the sort of satisfaction, if you will, of knowing that they've done the job that they need to do. They provide care quickly, they worry about whether they've done enough, then they rush off to go somewhere else to repeat that again. And that's maybe 20 or 30 times a day. So if you times that up by somebody's working week, it creates PTSD-like symptoms in people because of that persistent stress and anxiety caused by not getting the closure of actually being able to care in the way that many carers want to.
Yes, and that might have been the only human contact that elderly person's had all day, just
Correct.
that 15 minutes.
Yeah. And it, you know, inevitably, if it is just task-orientated, there's not time for conversation, there's not really time for chatting too much in that situation. What you find is in those very short visits that actually talking slows people down, so that it tends not to be something that gets done so much.
Mm-hmm. How many vacancies are there out there at the moment for carers?
Yeah, so according to Skills for Care, we currently have 111,000 empty jobs in adult social care. So that's 111,000 vacant jobs today. Significantly, that's the vacant jobs today for the demand that exists today. That demand is only increasing. You know, we have an ageing population, which means that more and more people are needing care. And I think you're right. I mean, I think it is connected in some way to the pay situation. It's also connected to the stress involved in the job. In the last 4 years, again, data from the Home Care Association shows that 619,000 people have left the workforce in the last 4 years. Now, those people haven't left the country, they've just left the workforce in care. They're now doing a job somewhere else within society. And what the care sector has struggled to do is to replace those leavers alongside the increased demand that comes from the ageing population.
And they really need to make the job more attractive because obviously it's a very demanding job for the carers.
I mean, I would say that the best way to think of the available market for carers is as a wedding cake. The top tier of the wedding cake is the overseas recruitment market. That categorically doesn't work, okay? In the 2.5 years that there were short-term visas being granted for carers coming into the UK, 216,000 visas were granted, and that created a net job creation benefit of 44,000 jobs filled.
So that's wildly unsuccessful.
It's either very, very inefficient, if we're being kind to it, or it just doesn't work, okay?
So the idea that we need immigration to help with these kind of low-paid jobs is not really working out.
No, I think it doesn't work out for a number of reasons, I think, and very often the people who are coming into the UK on care worker visa were overqualified for care work. They were better suited to nursing work. They were coming to the UK and then getting hoovered up by the NHS, which was very gratefully taking people into nursing jobs, right? But I think significantly it was masking the fact that there were lots of leavers from within the British workforce. You know, the 619,000 people over the 4-year period proves that people are leaving the sector, and therefore it doesn't matter how many people we're trying to bring in from overseas, it's not fixing that problem. So that's the top tier. The top tier doesn't work. 216,000 people in and 44,000 jobs filled. In order to fill 111,000 vacancies, we need to bring thousands and thousands more people. It just doesn't work. The middle tier of that wedding cake of available resource for staff is the existing workforce. So we've got 1.59 million people in that existing workforce, and about half of those work in domiciliary care, about 800,000 people working in home care. The problem is that it's 111,000 people not enough, and keeping people in that sector has been a hard thing. The bottom tier of the wedding cake of available staff, I think, is the easiest one to think about where we could have an impact, because that's everybody else within society. That's 34 million people of working age that could work in adult social care if the job was made more attractive. Now, the nice thing is that the 619,000 leavers are all still in that sector, but also if we're trying to find 111,000 people from a base of 34 million, that's an easier thing to think about how we might be able to do that. But we're not going to do that whilst ever we're asking people to work at less than the legal minimum wage and asking them to do too much work in too short a period of time.
So essentially what we're asking for is just for them to raise the minimum wage for carers, but then will that not just sort of have a knock-on effect, which is probably why government are sort of shying away from it, because then other sectors could argue that they want to be paid for travel.
Mm-hmm. I think it's an interesting thing, isn't it? There are many sectors where people are paid for travel and transitions during the day. But the reality is that this is not an issue here of whether we agree that care workers should be treated differently. This is about adherence to the minimum wage legislation, right? And on the data provided by Fairer Carer Pay, we're talking about the wholesale non-compliance of employers in the care space with the legal minimum wage legislation. So actually raising the minimum wage doesn't fix the problem. If we've currently got a minimum wage level that's not been adhered to, the problem here is making sure providers are actually adhering to what they should be legally adhering to.
The study showed that quite a large proportion of carers are actually just going into the industry because they can't get work elsewhere. Yeah. So they're not naturally carers. Do you think that affects the situation, or is it? I mean, I guess you're thankful for them to take it as a job anyway, but how does that work out?
I think the sector as a whole has viewed the recruitment and retention challenges that we have as a nation differently, I would say. In my business, we very much take a view that if we make the job more attractive, then we should only give the more attractive job that we've created to those who are worthy of that job in the first place. We have an effective selection process that we put people through to make sure that only the best are getting the job. In many organisations, that selection process is, can you stand up straight, have you got a pulse? Now, the problem with that is that you sometimes then don't get the right sort of people working in that space. And because the job's not very attractive, there was a study showed that 32% of everybody working in adult social care was doing so because they can't get a job anywhere else. I don't want those people looking after my mum. Yeah, and those people didn't ought to be working in care. There are other parts of the workforce where the job that they're doing is less damaging. If you're disinterested in the job that you're doing and you're stacking tins in Tesco's, then fair enough, right? The tins might not get stacked correctly. But if you're disinterested in the work that you're doing, or you're only doing it because you can't get a job somewhere else, and you're responsible for looking after a vulnerably placed adult in society, that's absolutely wrong. So I think one of the advantages of trying to make the job more attractive is that we're able also to raise the talent pool of those people who are in it. And there have been some exceptional carers over the course of the last 4 years who've left the sector because they've been broken by what the sector has asked them to do. I think if we have a more realistic ask on what we say a carer should do, it's far easier to think about how we might find people that are prepared to do that work.
So at what point do people end up having to pay for their own care? It seems like if they own a property, then they have to find the money, which of course is quite a lot of money per week, yep, whether it's in residential or visiting care. Has there been any sort of increase in that recently? Because it seems to have been very static for a while.
Yeah, the way people's wealth is treated when it comes to assessments and qualification for social care is different depending on which sort of social care you're receiving. So if you're being assessed for a move into residential care, the value of your property is taken into account. The assumption is that you're going to sell the home, and that's going to create wealth, and that wealth should then be spent down until you get to an upper capital threshold. For domiciliary care, the home value is not taken into account. Obviously, that's because the expectation is the person living at home is going to carry on living at home. What's interesting, I think, is that threshold, the upper capital limit, the point at which you qualify for free at the point of use social care, has not shifted for 15 years. So it's set at £23,250 and has been so for the last 15 years. Now, if it had been index linked, it would have moved to over £36,000 by now. The fact that it hasn't means that more people are being drawn into paying privately for their own care just by virtue of the fact that the government hasn't moved the threshold. It's not adjusted the threshold for 15 years.
So some of your findings sort of suggested that local authorities are actually using private care to subsidise the local authorities' care. How are they doing that? How is that allowed?
Yeah, I know. I would say that, well, the entire sector is supported by a couple of unlawful subsidies. Okay, in the first instance, not paying carers correctly is allowing some people commissioning care to buy care at a rate which is cheaper than the market rate. It is also quite common practice in domiciliary care specifically for a provider to do some work for the council and some work directly for a private individual. And in that situation, whether that split is half, so 50-50 or 60-40 or 70-30, you would typically find that the charge that's being made to the local authority is a lower hourly rate than it is for the private individuals. Now, the care is exactly the same care each time, whether it's funded by the council or whether it's funded by a private family. So those providers who are doing work for a local authority, for a council at maybe £22 an hour, might be charging a private family £30 to £35 an hour for exactly the same care. In essence, that family is subsidising the local authority contract in that situation. And I think we can probably all argue that there are lots of ways that money could be raised in order to ensure that councils can better fund the care packages that are needed. But the last people who should be subsidising a care package are people who are already paying for 100% of their own care costs. And what those families are very often doing is paying for maybe 125% of their care costs in order for some of that margin to be used to prop up a council contract.
When someone employs a carer, how are they explaining away this situation where they're not getting money for their actual travel time and the fact that they're having to pay? How would this affect their insurance?
Yeah, obviously, insurance is a really interesting point because the employer will always require the employee to have business insurance for working in care, and that's because the insurance companies recognise that there's an elevated risk of accident because the amount of driving that a carer will do during the working day. Yet some of those organisations will justify not paying their carers for their travel time by saying it's not actually work. Well, if it's needing business insurance, absolutely needs to be recognised as work in that situation, right? And so there's an inherent contradiction in there. I think it's a problem which is made worse because it's operating at around about the minimum wage threshold. You know, if carers were paid significantly more than minimum wage, then the hours of pay or not during the day would be less consequential. It's still not fair and it's still not honest in that situation because the employers are in some ways misleading their employees on what they're actually earning in that situation. But at least it wouldn't be throwing it below the minimum wage threshold. When you start at around about the minimum wage threshold, any driving that's not paid for at all, and we've said already there might be significant driving that's done, is going to take that carer below that minimum wage threshold, and that then becomes problematic. Now, how is it excused? Well, usually a carer will be paid for their mileage, and that's pence per mile travelled in the car. And very often that confusion is a confusion about a payment then for transit, which is actually there to cover the cost of fuel and the cost of wear and tear on the car, not for the time that a carer is driving from point A to point B. So we talk to carers who say, but I was paid for my travel time, I was paid 25 pence per mile. But that's not for time, that's for fuel and wear and tear on the car. The time should be treated separately and should be calculated separately. One is a business expense, the other one is pay that someone's entitled to.
So Unison has some research on carer pay.
Yeah, they do. So in July 2023, Unison published a report showing that by their data, 75% of care workers were not paid for their travel time. Now, although that wasn't specifically addressing their pay rate, within the report it found that their base pay rate was there or thereabouts minimum wage. So as a result of that, 3/4 of them not being paid for travel time meant that the inevitable consequence was that those people were then falling below the minimum wage threshold when it came to their real-time pay rate.